Hi, welcome to today's video. So this week you're going to see me doing a couple of paintings. The first one is in watercolor, and the second one using soft pastels. And I just wanted to point out a couple little differences between the wet media, such as watercolor, and the dry media, such as soft pastels. There's no such thing as a perfect medium, of course, but they all have different pros and cons. Watercolor, like any wet paint, you can mix the colors. So if you have a blue and a yellow, you can make a green, for example. You can't do that with soft pastels. Dry media, you can't mix them the way you would with a wet paint. So there are pros and cons like that. Watercolor is very unique amongst the different types of paint. You know, there are similarities between oil paint and acrylic, and of course there are many differences as well, but watercolor is quite different to any of those other paints, and the way it behaves and the way it interacts with the paper, and the type of paper that you use will affect how it interacts with the paint. It's a very unique medium. It's one of the reasons why I like watercolor so much. The other thing about watercolor is you can get these different types of edges. You know, if you put the wet paint onto dry paper, you get a harder edge. You put it onto wet paper and you get a more diffuse, softer edge. So the edges that you get are a big part of watercolor painting. When you compare that to, say, soft pastels, well, soft pastels, you don't get that. There's no, you put a mark onto the paper and that the pigment stays wherever you put it. It doesn't move around the way it does with watercolor painting, or at least wet watercolor painting. So that's one of the differences. It's not that, you know, one's better, it's just they have these differences. And as I said, with the dry media, the soft pastels, you can't mix the colors. So if you want a green, you have to go out and buy green pastel. If you want a different shade of green, you have to go out and buy that. And that's why you see, like, actual soft pastel artists, they often have thousands upon thousands of pastel sticks. I don't consider myself a pastel artist. It's just something that I enjoy using from time to time, so I don't have such a wide range of colors. But anyway, that's one thing to consider if you're going to get started with either of these media. The other thing about soft pastels, it's somewhere in between drawing and painting. It has certain elements that are characteristics that are like drawing, but then there's other things that are more like painting as well. So it's very interesting in that way. It's the same with charcoal, another, I guess, the other main dry media that most people would use. Charcoal, you don't have the color, but you can move the charcoal dust around the paper with your hands, your fingers, a cloth or something like this. And you can, again, create different types of edges and different effects. And it does feel somewhere in between drawing and painting. The soft pastels, again, the type of paper that you use has an effect on how the final painting looks, whether you're using a textured paper, a smooth paper, a colored paper, or white paper. So like watercolor, the paper has an effect on how your final painting looks. So these are the two paintings. Like I say, with the watercolor, I like the sort of atmospheric effects that you get, the different edges. The fact that you can mix the colors both on the palette but also on the paper itself. You know, if you paint wet in wet, the paint doesn't just sit where you put it, it moves out and it can blend with other colors that are already there, and you can get greens, for example, forming on the paper, and that can be interesting. You can play around with things like that. The soft pastels, on the other hand, you don't do that. Wherever you put the pigment, it just stays there, but it does allow you to create these expressive marks. You know, with the watercolor, especially wet painting, the watercolor you don't really get the brush marks surviving. Everything just sort of starts to blur together a bit. But with the soft pastels, the lines, the marks that you put onto the paper, they're there, they're preserved. They don't evaporate in front of your eyes. So, as I said at the beginning, there isn't as though one medium is better than the other. They all have their strengths and weaknesses. If I had to choose between them and I was only allowed to use one medium from now on, I would go with watercolor, I guess. I say watercolor is kind of unique, and it can do things that you can't really do with any other medium. So I'm happy that I don't have to make that choice, and I'm happy that I can play around with soft pastels when I want to. But yeah, I guess watercolor would be my favorite if I had to make that choice. Also, from a point of view of getting started, I would maybe suggest watercolor for people because it does have this ability to mix the colors. So you don't have to go out and spend a huge amount of money on different colors. And that is the one big downside with soft pastels, I think. But anyway, it's worth trying out these different types of media. If you want to try a dry medium to get started with, maybe charcoal. Okay, you don't have the colors, but you can still play around with charcoal. You can play around with different types of edges and different values, and you can learn from that. If you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching and listening. Hopefully see you again in next week's video.